Hi, my name is Ajnr Refutation, and today I'll be responding to Alberto's claim that marijuana is improving the healthcare system. Alberto used three secondary claims to support this. His first was that marijuana helps with diabetics. The second was that marijuana helps with seizures. And the third was that marijuana helps with the effects of chemotherapy. For his first claim, Alberto used a Medical News Today article by Jane Leonard to support his claim. Dr. Leonard in this article talks about how people who smoke marijuana on average have a smaller waist size, and people with a smaller waist size on average are less likely to develop type 2 diabetes. And this would be a fine claim, except for the fact that Dr. Leonard is a family doctor from North Carolina who does not specialize in the effects of marijuana. And in her article, she cites a paper by the American Alliance for Medical Cannabis as evidence. Not only is the paper from 2005, but the AAMC, or American Alliance for Medical Cannabis, is an organization that promotes the legal access to medical cannabis, so that brings up a potential bias. On top of this, a study by the ADA, or the American Diabetes Association, in 2013 found that chronic cannabis smoking is associated with insulin resistance, and insulin resistance increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. In the article, chronic cannabis smoking is described as smoking the equivalent of 9 joints worth of marijuana. So while the average smoker may not smoke that much, the effects of smoking like a lot of marijuana could eventually lead to developing type 2 diabetes. My opponent's second claim was that marijuana helps with seizures. Alberto used a CNN article as evidence to support this, and the article that he used was about a 6-year-old girl who had about 200 to 300 seizures per day, and after the use of marijuana, it went down to about 2 or 3, and they were usually in her sleep. The issues with this was that CNN tends to be liberal leaning, and this article was published in 2013. So this specific article could have been used to push for the legalization of marijuana, which brings up potential bias. And the issue with this also was that the article was about one isolated scenario, and so it wasn't statistical data, and there was only like a sample size of 1. So this doesn't mean that this would help other children or help other people in the same exact way. There would need to be a larger sample size. My opponent's claim was also very general, and when he says that marijuana helps with seizures, and so this includes adults, but the evidence that he used to support this only includes a child. So for this, he would have needed to provide like some statistical evidence for children and adults. My opponent's third claim was that marijuana helps with the effects of chemotherapy, and my opponent actually ran out of time during his speech, so I only had this based off of his outline. And in his outline, Alberto did not provide any evidence to support this claim. He simply stated that marijuana helps with nerve pain and nausea, but he provided no source. My opponent's reasoning process for this was flawed because there simply was no reasoning process. He made 2 statements with little to no support at all, and he only explained 2 side effects of chemotherapy, when his claim again was rather general, which included all side effects. So for this claim, he would have needed to include more. In conclusion, Alberto, I do not necessarily disagree with my opponent's main claim, but he needs more statistical evidence, and he needs to use like more sound reasoning process. For his first claim, which is that marijuana helps with diabetics, he could have used a more reliable source that was specializing in the area, and for the second claim, he could have used a source that could have used like a statistical source, or a source with a larger sample size that applied to everyone he was talking about. And then of course, if he had more time, he could have explained the third claim more. but he didn't. Thank you.
Do you have an outline?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Thank you. All right, structurally everything's easy to follow. On the first point, you kind of go after the source, which I thought was a reasonable press to make, that Dr. Leonard is a general practitioner who hasn't conducted any original research on this, that they are citing secondhand information from an advocacy group, and the fact that they're an advocacy group doesn't necessarily mean that the information is biased or wrong, but it does mean that they are maybe cherry picking some information. We should be able to see what the original data says, and we don't get that, and that I think is the problem that you want to present. I thought the better argument was on your second, the second piece of information that you had on that, and that is that the American Diabetic Association has done a study in contrast to the vague reference that the advocate presents that shows that marijuana consumption increases resistance to insulin, which is the problem that is at the basis of diabetes. And I thought that that's a good contradictory piece of information that responds directly to the point that the advocate's talking about. So the advocate says, well, people who smoke marijuana have thinner waists, according to a study that somebody else is citing, and people with thinner waists are less likely to have diabetes. That's a big assumption. On the other hand, the study says people who use a lot of marijuana have higher resistance to insulin. That's definitely more closely connected, and I think that's a good way to contrast that evidence. You could do a little bit more of that. On the second point, on the seizures issue, I don't think jumping on CNN for being a liberal-leaning organization or that their research was from 2013, I think you might want to point out that's a 5-year-old example. Do we have any other evidence that shows that marijuana use has a benefit to seizures? I think the better argument that you make is that it's an isolated case, it's a single example, making a generalization to other people with seizures without any other information on this point is a little bit problematic. I think that's the better argument on that. And on the last point, you said they ran out of time, so they didn't really present an argument. I think you could have stopped at that point, that there might be side effects. That's a possibility. There's not really any discussion of that. I do think that you could point out, for instance, that that marijuana is available in synthetic form for this purpose, that there are other medications that are available for whatever the negative effects of chemotherapy are, and there's not been any demonstration that marijuana is superior to the treatments that already exist for this. So exactly what is the argument that's being presented here? So I thought you were pretty solid at the start. And then you get to the summary, and your summary makes it sound like you're evaluating the speech and offering suggestions about how they can make a better argument instead of refuting the argument. So I would probably eliminate 2/3 of what you were saying in that summary and just stick with the claims that you presented earlier. All right, thank you.